Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk again about experts and the problems and the dangers with experts. The last two Science Moments also were on this, and this time I'm going to talk about their tools, the tools of experts and how it can bind them and blind them. So let me give you an example. I've always, as someone who tries to remain aloof from fields, as we've talked about before, I've often, when I enter a field, have thought to myself, it would be great if I build this fancy tool because I need to get this kind of data in order to test this sort of grand unifying theory that I have. And sometimes it might be a good idea to say, look, let me make it specific. So I've got one research area where I asked, is the dictionary, and this is sort of a one way to phrase it, and I'll phrase it another way. So, is the dictionary such that you can eventually unpack the definition? So, you've got a definition of whatever, it says elephant, and it says it's some gray giant animal, whatever. It's got a bunch of words after it. And then you can say, well, okay, I don't know what some of those words mean, so I'm going to go look it up in the dictionary again and figure out what those are. And eventually, you read those definitions and so on. And eventually, there's two possibilities. One is that it just leads you in a massive circle, and there is no ground, right? It doesn't hierarchically bottom out anywhere, in which case you can't really understand. The idea would be that you don't understand the meanings of words unless you have the whole web in your head all at once. Whereas the other way, it would be more reductionistic, where, eventually these things all ground out at some small number of fundamental primitive words that we sort of know via some other means. We sort of walk in knowing those, and once you know those, in some sense, that's enough to eventually unpack the meanings of everything else. So which way is it? Is it this sort of hierarchical thing that grounded on a small number of fundamental words which are learned in a different fashion than the dictionary, or is it just a big web? And this is a bigger question than the dictionary because it's really ultimately about how our own concepts, the meanings of all of these words and the meanings of concepts even before we had words are grounded out. Is it just a big old web, or do we, in our own head, if we've got 100,000 concepts that we have, different kinds of objects and predicates and properties and relations, all of the different kinds of things in the world, do they have meaning in our own brains? Do our own brains unpack their meanings in a hierarchical way, or is it a web? And so one way to ask that is to, let's say, what are dictionaries like? And let's go ask, are they in fact grounded hierarchically, or are they a web? So I set out to look at, there's a couple things called WordNet, and you can look at Oxford English Dictionary, and you can look at different kinds of ways to do it. So a first thought would be, okay, let's build software that grinds your way through tens and tens of thousands of these words, looks at their definition, and then unpacks, finds those definitions, and so forth. And it's not as easy as you might think, because in doing so, each different word often has 10 or 20 or 30 senses in there. And it doesn't tell you necessarily in the definition of a particular word which sense of that word it is. A human needs to figure this out. So anyway, it occurred to me I can build software that does this, and then I would have like the whole network, all of WordNet or all of the Oxford English Dictionary. I could do the whole entire thing. Now the problem with doing that, I realized, was that, look, as soon as you do that kind of thing, and as a theorist, one, it can take, you might say, I'm a reasonable programmer, I could say I might have something up and running in a few weeks. That's often the feeling that one has. One, I knew that invariably it's not going to be 3 or 4 weeks. You're going to find bugs, and then you're going to want to make it even cooler and better, and you're going to want to ensure that it has these certain kinds of controls in it, and it's easily the thing that can turn quickly into 1, 2, 3 years of work. Two, as soon as you are happy with the output of the product that you've built, well, everything that you see in the world from then on looks like something you can apply that to. There's those grants. Oh, I can now say that with my fancy thing that I built, I can go do that and that and that. All stuff that I wouldn't be interested in were I not to have spent and wasted time and sunk costs into this pretty little machine that I built. And then third, anytime that you build software that goes out and grabs or analyzes real data, you ultimately have to actually do by hand data analysis to even know whether the thing that you built is on track, is calibrated right, is actually doing the job. And you have to come up with some kind of benchmark data that really says, okay, this is actually on track. There's order to the universe. This is getting us the right kinds of results because data is incredibly messy. Data is always messy. Data is always has tons of things that lead to systematic errors, tons of just weird stuff that don't even make sense until you go in there, and they completely bias your results. And there's 25 different ways that'll happen that you couldn't have anticipated ahead of time unless you actually went through the data and tried it yourself. And so as a theorist who's only going to be in that field for a short period of time, my attitude was like, I don't want to suffer from these sorts of problems, and I don't want to spend all this time because I'm going to move on. And I've got to, even if I did build one of these, I'm going to have to do this sort of hand-constructed data set myself, where I'm going by myself, seeing what the data actually looks like for some large number so that I could compare it. So I said, forget about the machine, the fancy software that probably wouldn't work and probably would take 2 years and certainly would take my brain hostage for the next few years and ensure that I just work on things that are all about hitting nails. Everything that I can see in the world just becomes nails that I can hit my new hammer with. I don't want to go there. Instead, I'm just going to build the calibration set. And so what I did is I just went out and I created a random sample of words. I can't remember, it was several thousand words. And by myself, I just went through each of these words, both in Oxford English Dictionary and in WordNet, and just took their definitions. And for each word in their definitions, found the appropriate sense that only a human can do. So, okay, this is this particular sense of that word. Looked at those definitions and just followed this through. So this is about a month of work. But once you've done it, you're done. All right. There's no. Now you've got this. You really get this data. You can see that in this process, I learned a lot. I said, oh my gosh, there's this particular artifact with how both of these networks work, and if you don't control for that, you're going to end up just with garbage, which I would never have known otherwise. But anyway, I never thereby became an expert in sort of a linguistic hierarchical structure kind of, these sorts of questions, whether it's a web or not. I didn't want to become that kind of expert. I just wanted to be able to get in and get out and do the hard work that's needed. And this is where experts are different. So experts would say, look, I'm going to do my whole dissertation on this, and I'm going to build this fancy software. And for the rest of their life, they're banging things with that same thing that they built. And they're getting potentially success in the sense that they're getting grants because they can show, I've got this fancy thing that I've worked, and no one else has this particular machine. But it completely lobotomizes them. They're unable to work on the ranges of problems where they would have had the most success. They're unable to actually see problems for their own sake. All that they see is potential applications for their cool device they've spent lots of time on. Now, by the way, the short answer to this actual question is that it turns out that dictionaries, and thus probably our lexicon in our brains, ultimately are hierarchically founded on a very small number of very abstract terms. They get bottomed out at the bottom, and there's about 7-ish plus or minus 2. That's not a formal, it's just sort of vaguely 7-ish hierarchical levels to these hierarchies, so that you define on the basis of these couple hundred-ish 100 plus or minus 50, so there's more than one way to do this. You use those to define some slightly more specific kinds of concepts, and then you use those ones to define others, and use those. And in fact, this is exactly what you would expect if you want to build a dictionary that is as small as possible. If you tried to define all 100,000 words just using the 200 words that you have at the bottom, each of those 100,000 words would have a definition that's really, really long. It would be really, really long, and the total dictionary would be really big. But instead, if you built just one intermediate level, so now you've got the 200 words, which are used to define, let's say 4,000 words, and then use those 4,000 words to define the rest of the 100,000. Now, each of those 100,000 things can now use those intermediate level words, and so they can be a little bit shorter. And it turns out when you say how many levels is optimal, it's around 7-ish. And so it turns out to be consistent with trying to minimize the size of the overall lexical dictionary in your brain. And bringing this back to COVID as an example of the world sliding sideways, which can happen in many reasons, and is due to a failure of experts. And one of the kinds of failures of experts was the modelers. And I'll get into modeling and issues and problems with models. Models themselves are a kind of monstrosity that I've always avoided becoming a modeler. Theorists ain't modelers. That's not what I am. And, they provide basically no understanding ever. So, but the point of mentioning the modelers who created a lot of the scare, and I blame journalists and politicians and other academics just as much as I blame the modelers. Modelers are the kinds of folks who are disproportionately often caught up in this everything looks like a nail when you're holding a hammer. Their models are highly sophisticated. They're crap, but they are highly sophisticated. They tend to be highly sophisticated. It takes them years to get them up and running, to have all the bells and whistles that they need and want. They've used them to get millions of dollars of grants over the years. Their entire career is often completely, everything is revolving around the tool that they made. And it completely blinds them, as it blinded the modelers who got everything wrong. Everything that the modelers said was an order of magnitude or two higher than what actually happened. None of them considered what the organic free movements could be if things where people were motivated to say, they were motivated on their own rather than coercion being part of this. It was all done by people who were blinded by the tools that they had built their expert careers around. And that was your science moment.